Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
For over 20 years, and he is just one of the most creative, as I'm sure most of you know, but as someone who's really studied his mathematics and his wonderful ideas, he is one of the most creative minds of the 20th and now also the 21st centuries. He's won many, many awards, had many honors. I'll just mention the Wolf Prize in Physics, which has gone to a lot of amazing people, but I think this was one of the very best choices of the Wolf Prize that I had ever seen. And he is a faculty member at Yale, and a long time IBM fellow. He's going to be talking to us on his book tour now about his new book, which is a book in economics, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm very much looking forward to it, and there are a lot of copies here, so I hope all of you buy them. So I would like to welcome Benoit.
Thank you very much. I still remember when you came into my office at Harvard. Actually, I was doing something else, and I was not very receptive. And you told me that you thought that I would like to listen to what you had to say, because you have proven a certain assertion of mine after having started in a big effort to disprove it. So that was a very wonderful occasion. Well, it's very difficult to speak of this book by itself, and since I've been going around for giving lectures for so many years by now, I have got into the habit of first making a more general lecture to in a way place my various activities in a general framework. It is not so easy. I fully realize that for a long time the link between some of my interests was very, very far from obvious. But one of the good things about living old, the main good thing is that the alternative is terrible. But the other thing is that when one gets on a position which is very strange, of seeing one's own life after 2 generations, sort of, because I'm writing papers now with a student of a student, in a certain sense my grandchild, which gives me a feeling of how younger people look at certain situations. Well, so for a long time I couldn't tell in few words what my work was about, and or actually was saying it, but in a hidden fashion, and then it hit me. What I've been working all along is at one of the major interfaces in human experience since time immemorial. Primitive man found around him or her a few smooth shapes, like the pupil and the iris of the eye, like some berries, like full moon. You make a list: 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands, and that's it. The rest is very rough. And so what happened to these 2 contradictory parts of human experience? The smooth gave rise first to informal geometry and then to formal geometry, and Greek geometry and mathematics and science. The smooth has been developed in extraordinarily detailed fashion by scientists over the centuries. What about the rough? Well, the rough remained essentially untouched. And to the extent that a measure of roughness was not available, which about the means that it had not grown beyond the critical moment in the history of the field where intuitive quality is transformed into something can be measured by number. And what fractal geometry is about beginning a theory of roughness. So the thing is, I say here, the rough and the smooth. I'm going to work in a very complicated fashion. I have a very long PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to skip most of it, but stop every so often, make comments. And about halfway, I will get to the topic of this presentation, which is what I think I remember what it is. Sometimes I'm not. Well, this is actually irrelevant, but let me. I received Japan Prize last year, so. Somebody says nice things about me, I say thank you, and and then here I give a lecture about my prize to this gray-haired lady who happens to be the wife of the emperor, therefore the empress. And so what she asked me was, "What is there anything in your prize which has a relation to anything I know?" And in fact, the answer was yes, Your Majesty. And in a few minutes, I'll give you gist of my answer. But let me sort of go roughly as I see what I've done. And it's not a case of a research program which I submitted to an agency and worked over for 52 years now, because my PhD was 52 years ago, but something which afterwards it occurred to me. So first of all, was roughness. Well, here are some rough surfaces. My friends in geology tell me that when they teach new students, they tell them, whenever you take a picture of anything in earth sciences, always put an element of scale. Camera, cap, hammer, yourself, anything. Because otherwise you forget about the size this thing is. And indeed, this was not the size you think, not a camera cap, but something much bigger. And in other words, my friends explain to students that there is something very complicated in the world, and to take account of this complication, the proper fashion is to exert police action, because that's police action. You order the students to put an element of scale. Now, an alternative to police action is some thinking. And so instead of following for police action, I thought, why is it that these surfaces have the property that I couldn't tell their scale unless you put an element of scale? Because they're scale-free. Today, the idea of scale-free shapes, which I named fractals, and of power laws and so on, is very, very common. When I studied them in part of a PhD in 1952, they were way out of the mainstream. But the question is, what is common in these things which can be described as being a measure of roughness? Well, I'll come to it in a few minutes. You have guessed it is either the fractal dimension, which is one of many forms of an idea that was first brought in 1919 by Hausdorff in a completely pure mathematical context without any application in sight whatsoever, or more precisely, application of a concept which a man named Hölder used in 1870, again for no purpose whatsoever. These are parts of mathematical esoterica. And to me, as I remember these matters, it is always a source of wonder that to get a hold on something so ordinary, so routine, so low-brow in a certain sense, as roughness, as shape of dirt and so on, one should need such refined mathematical tools. For the other sciences, the situation was easier. For example, when one found a way of measuring the pitch of sound, the sound was approximated by sinusoid, in other words, by circular motion, uniform circular motion, which is a very, very simple, smooth process. Same thing for color being interpreted in terms of frequencies. But for roughness, no measure of roughness worked until these very, very refined shapes were applied to it. And I'll come to it in a few moments. Now, I'm at an unfavorable angle to see what I'm talking about. So I have this program. Well, identify occurrences of pure fractal roughness. What do I mean by that? Well, acoustics does not pretend to represent every sound. It does not. It represents vowels in sung voice, but not consonants. It does not represent well the response of concert halls. But to represent a very large number of phenomena is good enough. So they're called pure sounds, and here the pure roughness is one which has a property which can be studied of self independence with respect to dilation or reduction. Identify or invent tools to handle pure roughness. I mentioned two. I'll come back to them very quickly. For the identify, for the invent, one of the principal ones which I invented was multifractals, which I invented for the purposes first of turbulence and immediately afterwards of representing price variation, a step beyond just the preceding tools by a long stretch, very much in process of being built. Now, and then the third part, explain, which has been done very well in some cases, not at all in others, very often learn to live with, to avoid or minimize, or learn to seek roughness. And here comes something which in my life has been marked a very major change at one point. I used to say that it was extraordinary that primitive man was seeing around him or her mostly rough shapes, whereas if we are here, presumably less primitive, even though sometimes one wonders, humans, we see mostly very, very smooth shapes, because engineering tends to produce flat walls, flat things, and so on. For a very, very long time, the examples of roughness which I was dealing with were not at all in the domain of engineering, but the domain of the uncontrolled aspects of either nature. Nature is what nature is, and the other word, which to contrast, which I use, is culture, by which I denote, for convenience, everything that was done by man. And that includes the internet and the stock market and all kinds of other things. It's astonishing that how similar they happen to be in many ways. But today things are very different. After, I don't know, 20 years of saying that fractals have no practical application, practical meaning being understood in a very practical sense, that has long ceased to be the case. The internet is filled with fractals, and traffic on the internet is multifractal. It's one of the biggest applications of fractals, an enormous one. I just learned recently that Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola bottles, the plastic they use is mixed with a little additive, which happens to be fractal, and which prevents them from breaking as they used before. They didn't break very often, but each break had very severe consequences. So the person who informed me of that says it's a multi-billion-dollar business, which I think is big enough to be classified as important. But to go on something much closer, early on, I was commenting that it was strange that antennas should be just sticks, and maybe I could go a bit further. But that worked extraordinarily well, and now people have developed fractal antennas, which have much better properties than the previous antennas. Previous ones were easy to calculate with a stick or a stick and a cross or something, but when it became more and more complicated, the calculations became almost impossible, whereas fractal antennas, calculations are very easy again. It's like in physics, a few particles is very difficult, but many, many particles is easier, and so fractal antennas are very, very widely accepted. Then I went a couple of months ago to visit Caltech, and somebody wanted to show me his lab, and here on the tip of a pin was a little black dot, and he said, look at the black dot, and the black dot was a capacitor of 1 farad of capacity. Now, in my time, a farad of capacity was something 1 meter squared. In other words, by folding the capacitor suitably, one can get something which is... So this man is doing all of electronic circuits and so on in terms not of the the very smooth, flat capacitors and straight resistances or helical resistances, but of shapes which are, the contrary, very rough and very complicated. And of course fractal, otherwise they could do nothing about it. So the number of applications is growing very, very rapidly, and the most important one in many ways is the one which was given here a title, which is the title of my new book about prices. Now, standard topic, standard example of what a surface that is self-similar can be. And I'm going to try this system, which I never tried before. That's apparently, no, it's not. Oh, yes, it has. Well, whatever. You see that if you take a small piece of it, you cut it, you get. And then I'll go very rapidly also another topic, which is very, very important, which bothered me increasingly as time went on. Early on, I was very pleased to have found those strange practical uses or concrete uses of the most esoteric corners of analysis and set theory. And then these uses increased, and very early on, I had done in the 60s both this work on prices and this work on turbulence, and the question arose, how come that the two phenomena so different from each other in their origin, in their structure, should be so similar in the tools required to handle them? And so I became sort of interested in trying to find out where mathematical fractal structures designed by purpose to be self-similar, invariant with respect to blowing up and reducing, when were they first considered by humanity. It turns out that humanity has known them forever and forever. So to come back to my first page, the smooth gave rise to science. The rough was not at all unutilized, and one feature of roughness, self-similarity, which primitive man must have perceived very strongly, was used in many cases. This is an example of a town in Zambia, which is constructed in a completely hierarchical fashion. This is an example of the Salvatore Dali, The Face of Death. Dali, I don't think, knew anything about esoterica, the mathematical esoterica. He painted this well before fractal geometry began, but he found that for effect, to give this feeling of horror that the war and dead man's head would present, repetition of a theme was strongest. And I found in a book to the left this preliminary draft in which he had different treatment for the eyes and the mouth, and clearly he found them less strong, less violent, less conducive to what you want to say than the repetition. Repetition in this sense has very great power. I could go on forever, in fact I have gone forever speaking about that matter, but let's now come to what I told the Empress of Japan. I asked her to remember some drawings of Hokusai, Hokusai, it's not Hokusai, but Hokusai, they tell me, a Japanese paint artist who lived around 1800. He published this great grand wave, which is in my book of 82. I never knew about his book, The 100 Views of Mount Fuji, but it's an astonishing piece of work, because in every one of these views there is an element of Mount Fuji, this element of almost conical, and then other structures. In addition, you see on the beach here all this seaweed accumulated. Well, one of the standard fractals, repetitive structures, is exactly the seaweed. Now, without any benefit of mathematics, Hokusai saw that in his world. In this one, look very carefully at the projection of the cloud on the Mount Fuji. It is not a sphere, but a sphere with billows upon billows upon billows. And imitations which we did of clouds start with this principle in some way. Hokusai didn't have any need of that, he was doing cartoons all the time of this sort. Look at the structure, look at his efforts to try to get lightning. That was not very successful. But so Hokusai saw the world in a very simplified fashion, which some things were Euclidean, Mount Fuji, and then when the humans, their hats are round and their walking sticks are straight, everything else is simplified whenever possible to be fractal. The astonishing situation, and the Empress of Japan remembered that very well. Well, Pollock, that's Eiffel Tower. Eiffel was a very great engineer, and well before those mathematical refinements were discussed, he had the idea that instead of having beams for the Eiffel Tower, have trusses, and each of these trusses is made not of beams but of trusses of higher order. It's an extremely light building for itself. Now, let me go very quickly through the definition of fractal dimension in the simplest case. The basic idea of fractal geometry is that a broad range of rough phenomena happen to be self-similar. That is, it has same shape locally and globally. In fact, have no preferred scale in the simplest cases. Well, for that, a concept has been found useful, namely dimension. And here dimension is explained in the case of strings, handkerchiefs, and boxes, and you divide them in equal parts. Dimension is logarithm of the number of parts, divided by log of the reduction ratio. And if you do it by more complicated shapes, the left is zigzag, and then the middle is more complicated zigzag, dimension becomes a fraction, 1.26, 1.5, 2, etc. And this fraction, not so much in these cases, which are a bit too simplified, but in other cases, I'll give you an example very, very shortly, is indeed a very, very, very strong measure of roughness as we perceive it automatically. And now, here I would like to open a parenthesis because I mention something which I will not have time to discuss because it will take all time, which is notion of negative dimension. Now, dimension in elementary geometry is 1, 2, 3, 4, or more precise 1, 2, 3, and 4 if one listens to space-time. Then it's convenient to say that a point has dimension 0, that's easy. And that the empty set has dimension -1. But I found that in order to carry out certain experiments in turbulence, it was indispensable to introduce notion of negative dimension. That is, not to introduce notion of a single empty set, not to introduce notion of set, but to introduce the notion of not a set defined as itself, but defined as a limit. It sounds very vague, but let me elaborate. In elementary pre-axiomatic mathematics, a straight line did not exist. It was a collection of very thin tubes. As the tubes become thinner and thinner, they end up by becoming a straight line. And in 1900, Minkowski had shown that this very primitive thinking actually was very useful to avoid paradoxes in mathematics. But if you look at the intersection of two lines in three-dimensional space, it's empty. There's nothing to say about it. If you look at the direction of two tubes in two-dimensional space, if they are at random, then they will intersect every so often. And I'm so ashamed to be so quick on it, but I want always to say a few words about it. It's a case in which an operation which is forbidden, which gives a ridiculous result, if taken seriously, ends up by being real. Like negative numbers were first observed, then they became given a meaning. Square root of -1 was given a meaning, and here a negative dimension was given a meaning. And if you measure, if you make measurements of turbulence in a laboratory along a line, which was the topic of my interest at that time in early 70s, what you do in effect is to intersect the turbulent fluid by a straight line. And so the question is, do you hit in this fashion some of the interesting parts in which turbulence is highest or is lowest? And to specify those domains, you need negative dimension. Anyhow, I jump on that to get to Brown cluster because, in particular, because of one of you. and because of myself. In around 1980, I was writing this book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature, and had become very aware of the fact that Brownian motion had become the subject of hundreds or thousands of books. However, nobody had looked at Brownian motion, big Brownian motion, carefully for a very long time. So I had this Brownian motion traced, and it was just something which has no particular interest, very messy. Initially it was traced starting at one point, say the bottom left, and wandering around bottom right. But that shape was not homogeneous. The two ends are different from middle part. So to make it more homogeneous, I arranged for the Brownian motion to end where it started. The procedure, for those of you who are into these things, is to take both coordinates to be Wiener Brownian bridges, the same periodicity. So I get this function of particular interest. I was looking at it and trying to understand it better, and to do so, decided to fill it in. So all the points which can be accessed from outside with crossing Brownian motion are in white, and the points which cannot be accessed are in black. Now, in theory, I didn't add anything. I subtracted something, all the interesting gory detail inside. But in fact, by subtracting, I added something, namely the notion of boundary of Brownian motion. Nobody had studied boundary Brownian motion for a very simple reason, that nobody had seen the boundary. On this thing, you don't see it. It doesn't impose itself upon you. On this picture, once filled, it imposes you completely. And again, I say that dimension is a proper measure of roughness, and I've been testing myself and tested by others who bring to me some new fractals and challenge me to guess the dimension. I found that I was doing very well, that somebody would bring a new construction. I would say, well, it is not quite 1.5. It was 1.48, for example. That was my precision, 1 or 2 for a curve in plane, 1 or 2 hundredths. And this one, the minute it appeared on the screen, I screamed my assistant, who thought I was getting deranged, and saying, "Stop it, let's look at it. This thing is talking to me, it's telling me a story, it's saying I'm an island, and I'm a very complicated island." And by then I have been doing all these imitations of coastlines and mountains that you may have seen for many, many years. I was very familiar with islands, and this one was going to be among the most complicated in existence. So my first instant guess was dimension 4/3. We measured it, and dimensional coastline was 1.33336. Well, here are two things put together. That's the way it appeared in my book. Well, that was in 82. For 18 years, nobody could prove it. And then, of course, it was proven here, and together with Lawler and with Werner in Paris. I would like to stop for a moment here, even though it's completely outside of the topic of this lecture. I have spent a great deal of time in recent years on two tasks. One is to teach some mathematics to non-math students at Yale, and then to teach mathematics to the math teachers in Connecticut. The two communities are fairly similar in the sense the same textbook, which is a big website, gigantic, which you can access freely. Yale does not charge for accessing it on the classes Math 190 at Yale. And so we use this example all the time to convince the high school teachers are all convinced that mathematics stopped existing sometime around the time of Fermat. Why? Because the enormous publicity about Fermat's theorem had been finally proven, so they assume that nothing since had been invented and required to be proven. The publicity had positive and negative effects. Now we show them this 4/3 and tell them how it came back to a very concrete kind of problem. How my guess turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to prove. Everybody promised a proof for next week, and again took 18 years and the efforts of three brilliant mathematicians to do it. And mathematics is well alive and in good shape. It's for them a very interesting phenomenon. Well, let me go fast on these because I have no time to discuss them. Of course, the Mandelbrot set, I would like to make only a few comments about it. I see that there are some copies of my book on the Mandelbrot set, which appeared early this year. I reproduced my early papers, only 4 or 5, and the conjectures they include, and also the early graphics, which were never published, and also, as I will show you in a moment, graphics which I have done before. And the basic fact was that I've been thinking about iteration for 30 years before getting into this subject. As I mentioned at lunch to those who had lunch together, this was a topic I was very strongly pressed on me when I was looking for a PhD topic long ago. I found it impossible to do so. I left aside. Then I looked at it, and the first pictures of Mandelbrot set were extraordinarily terrible compared to this one. But I was helped by a ridiculous mistake. Had I thought a little bit when I asked my programmer to draw this set, I told him to draw only the top part because the set is symmetric, so there's no need to do both. But I didn't think of it, or I'm too much in a hurry, or it was too far in the night. We had the computer only around 2 a.m. And so I told him to go ahead and print that. And around the black thing, which was sort of rather clear, as you'll see, rather clear, it was plenty of horrible mess. And the mess was so horrible that I think most people have just thrown this thing in a wastebasket because nothing was visible. But I noticed that there were 2 of the messes which are symmetric. The biggest island on the left fork towards the top. Again, is that? Oh yes, there is this thing. This island here and this island here, and let me show it there as well. This. Well, it's too complicated. Well, all right. These 2 islands appeared as being symmetric pieces of dirt, and that's the characteristic of much of my life is that I take enormous gambles. I've taken gambles of every kind, but I'm a very meticulous and pedantic person in many ways. So I look at these pictures again and again, and the symmetry bothered me. So what we did, of course, to look at them closer, and I will show you pictures of it. It turned out that they were little islands of the main set. So let me show you this thing. The sort of top left corner is the oldest picture I have, which is left, appeared in 1980. And what's remarkable is the dreadful quality of that. That was done at Harvard with equipment which boggles the imagination, which was very primitive by the standards of the day, but was enough for me to observe that this piece of dirt was in fact this very, very striking little island. Then in the middle to the right, a blow-up of it, not quite the same as the main body of the set, but somewhat distorted, with little things floating around. In the bottom, another of these islands. And then I look at other values of parameter. This is all iteration of Z squared plus C, and these are Julia sets, and the other one was the Mandelbrot set. That's a piece of Mandelbrot set at different levels of approximation. And then this one blowing up a piece to show how it looked like. I made a certain number of conjectures about that at that point. In particular, I had 2 definitions of Mandelbrot set. One which everybody has adopted because it's so easy to do, but the one which interested me first was something very different. We had the map Z squared plus C, repeated, squared plus C, squared plus C, squared plus C. And I was interested in values of C for which this sequence has a finite stable limit cycle. And that approximation was set from inside. But this approximation was very difficult to carry out. The computers were slow, and it was just messy. So I prefer to look at the other approximation, the outside definition, which everybody knows. But my conjecture was that two are identical, more precisely that the outside approximation, the Mandelbrot set is defined by the outside approximation, is the closure of the set defined by the inside approximation. Well, that conjecture is still unproven. It's chastening to think that something which is so obvious by visual examination, if you respect pictures as I respected them, I still respect them, that something was so difficult to prove, because it had been now 24 years since this conjecture was stated, and everybody promised proof for next week, and at this point nothing is available. Peter Jones from Yale wrote a foreword to this yellow book in which he explains the effect it has. Now, if you have a picture of 79 at IBM, equipment was marvelous. It was all Rube Goldberg we made out of existing printing machine, but despite what we did was irrelevant. Have beautiful pictures, and I was looking at these pictures, all these pictures, and saw 79 on top, a little Mandelbrot set. But I saw it, but didn't discover it. I could not look at it closely. I made no observation about it. It was just a strange something which was floating around. And as I think of it now, retrospectively, it's as if madness would have taken me at that time to, how to say, begin organic chemistry by making chemistry of very large alcohols or sugars, and not the chemistry of water or of the hydrogen molecule. And at IBM, I was under this impression that Z squared plus C was too simple to be interesting, so I didn't touch it. And I went to Harvard. I had no choice because the equipment was so dreadful. So I did Z squared plus C. And then when I looked at these things, I found all the pieces which are now very familiar with Julia sets of Z squared plus C are here together combined in, well, again, like a big chemical process. Now, why I choose this function? The function is Z squared plus 1 squared divided by 4 times Z cubed minus 1. Why? Well, because somebody in 1917 had written a paper that an uncle of mine had pointed out to me as being very interesting, in which that transform was one which was chaotic in the plane. That was not the words used, but you start from any point and change the origin slightly, you change completely the orbit, and the orbit fills the plane. So if you look at the next one, I'm very, very close to 1/4. I replaced 1/4 by factor lambda. So when you are in the black domain, you go to one collection of limit points and cycles. White domain, you go a different collection. And so there are some domains which can make a little mistake and still remain and converge to the same limit. Over most of it, you make a small mistake and you converge to nothing at all. Small mistakes initially make you go haywire. So I wanted to study chaos in the plane. That was the initial motivation. And so that this was decently complicated, and again got nothing until necessity had me go into it. Now let me get to the topic of the book, which is the variation of prices. So in early 60s, in a way which I describe in this book, an extraordinary incident, very fortunate one, made me aware of the problems raised by variation of prices. My host was Henk Houtaker, professor of economics at Harvard, told me that until then they were complaining about lack of data in economics and about lack of tools. But now they couldn't complain because data are beginning to be very abundant, and tools, they could computers to apply tools, but they found the application of computers to the tools gave totally ridiculous results. For example, he was particularly interested in the price of cotton, and he would just try to measure the volatility of cotton by taking the root mean square deviation from some kind of trend, and found that depending on which piece of the evidence you took, you got results all over the landscape. That data are very abundant, and they gave no result whatsoever. Well, the drawings I had made on blackboard reminded me of something I knew about power laws, again installed in this book. So I came home with boxes of cards, which Hautaker gave me to get rid of, and started playing with them. And so that's the beginning of a long story. Let me, here to the right, summarize this story. The top line is a sequence of independent Gaussian variables. A Gaussian white noise, or white Gaussian noise. So most values fall between -3 sigma and +3 sigma. A few values go a little bit outside, but not much. And so what Hautaker told me is that this was not at all the reality of cotton prices, that cotton prices had a nasty habit every so often of moving violently up or down. And these things would never move up or down. So I thought of it, I looked at the data, I thought of also very much of folklore. I'm a great believer in folklore. More precisely, I'm a great believer in the fact one must listen to folklore. Most of it is bunk and must be weeded, but folklore does often represent knowledge acquired by humanity over a long period of time. So somebody had given me the folklore that if you look at market prices in newspapers, you couldn't tell what the scale is. The thing could be, at that time, prices every minute didn't exist, but daily prices over a period of a few months, or weekly price or longer period of monthly prices or whatever, unless you look at the coordinates, you couldn't tell them apart. So I had this vague suspicion that perhaps the prices could have this property of scale invariance, and whether they did or did not was not a matter of discussion ahead of time, but a matter of testing. So I took these data, which about the price of cotton in New York over 5 years, about 1,500 data, and plotted them and devised a model. And the model is shown here on the second line. It certainly has very big peaks up and down. At that time, the graphics abilities were so non-existent that I could not make these pictures. I could only rely upon indirect pictures in newspapers. Then the other thing that the data indicate to me, that the other assumption of economic theory, more precisely of a model due to Bachelier, which was discovered in 1900 but became fashionable about the same time I got in the business. In that model, price changes were Gaussian independent and independent, so it's Brownian motion. So independent of price, well, independence was very, very far from being satisfied by cotton prices, absolutely not independent. And so I did another piece of work about long-term dependence, which was very much influenced by the study of the River Nile. How that comes together is a long story, which I try to tell in this book. But then, in one case I was studying large deviations in the margins, the other case the large deviations in dependence, but never getting to grips with the biggest thing, which was the fact that in prices you have both large deviations in amplitude of the price changes and very strong dependence. Now that thing was the third stage of my work, and that's where multifractals came in. So now please look at the 5 bottom figures. Some of them are real price changes, and others are models. Now, what they have in common, that if you took the volatility as defined by second moment with respect to, well, a trend, or here simply second moment, it varies very greatly from place to place. For example, in help. Which is the one which no. Somebody tell me how I get reliably. Okay, so look at the second red thing. The first half it sort of varies a lot. The second half mostly varies much less, but when it varies a huge lot. So no. Does somebody know how about this machine? Well, no, don't worry. Please remind me, how do I get the
This is 40 volts per megavolt.
no, but
Oh, the laser? The top. Very. Let me get you another pointer because that one's like really dim.
He'll get you a separate pointer.
okay. Well, so to tell you a few other things of interest, those five records here are all white. That is, if you look at the price changes now and any other period, they're uncorrelated.
It's right there. It's kind of backwards.
Thank you. Okay, so what this thing shows is that you can be uncorrelated and be extremely different from that. It's a shattering fiction for probabilists because, of course, it's a well-known fact that independence and uncorrelation are synonymous in the Gaussian case, but in non-Gaussian case, one is much more general than the other. But most people think that there's small difference. But here, these enormously big differences are compatible with whiteness. What does it mean is that if the price changes a great deal today, then, say a few days from now, there is a very much increased probability of the price being again very big. It can either continue that previous thing further, or it can erase it. So if you know the price change now, the absolute value of price change, say in 5 days, is very, very much dependent on the price change yesterday, but the sign may be completely unknown. And if the sign is completely plus or minus, then on the average is 0. Therefore, two things are uncorrelated. But if you take absolute values, it's not uncorrelated at all. So there is a whole complex of stories. Let me tell them, assuming that some of you are old-fashioned engineers. I mean, too few are gray-haired to be really old-fashioned. but one of the students, I knew that some electrical engineers, when they would take spectrum of something, also took the spectrum after rectification. So they replaced the noise by square or the absolute value. And they viewed it as important, brought them some information. I was not particularly paying attention to what they were doing, so I couldn't tell you. But in this particular case, if you look at this record here, which I think is IBM stock turned around in some fashion to make it not immediately recognizable. The spectrum of it is essentially white. So when the spectrum became possible to evaluate after the Tukey-Hooley algorithm, everybody applied it to prices, and they found it was white. They looked at that. It was white. So what they do? Well, they do the only sensible thing anybody can do. They put it under the rug and nailed it very strongly. It was incomprehensible. There was no way to explain why this was so. So, the rumor was that spectral analysis was not a good method for prices. Well, recently, of course, more recently, not so recently, but a few years ago, what I just said was done to redo massively the spectra and also to redo massively the spectra of the absolute values or of squares, and the former are white and the others are absolutely not white. In fact, they are very, very strongly suggest the scale-free processes. So, how about how they differ, these phenomena from this? So here there are these deviations, and this I think was October 87 turned around because IBM stock went down that day by an amazing amount. That was 23 sigma, they said. I don't know how they evaluate sigma, but they said 23 sigma. But 10 sigma is all over the place. This is 10 sigma, this is 10 sigma, this is 10 sigma, 10 sigma. What's the probability of 10 sigma in the Gaussian distribution? Well, it is not in the tables at all because nobody was interested, but you can apply the formula, and it is 1 millionth or a millionth or a millionth or a millionth. It's more or less the inverse of Avogadro's number. It should never happen. It happens every day, somewhere, to somebody. Every day, a drug company stock is 100, the drug is accepted, becomes 1,000, or the drug is turned down by FDA and becomes 100 cents or nothing. So gigantic price changes occur. So the idea that they are just sort of, you can say, well, they're just outliers. They're special. It's the thing on top plus other things. If that were the case, economics would have been a very simple issue because these processes, this process on top is defined by a single parameter, which is the volatility. Volatility is the variance, the energy in physics, which in other words, temperature. So it will be simple in physics, because physics you have always temperature and pressure, or temperature and volume, and that will be just temperature. Now, the idea that economics is easier than physics is a bit preposterous, but in fact it's not, because of course there are special cases. Now, what do special cases mean? Once a guy described 10 years, 10 years of his experience on Wall Street, and he said that if during these 10 years he had gone to the beach or fishing every day except on 7 days, his fortune after 10 years was about the same, because everything of interest happened over the 7 days. And in general, if you look at long-range behavior prices, the daily plus and minuses are very important for individuals who want to replace the income of 6% by 6.2% by taking big risks. But the big fortunes and the big catastrophes occur in individual cases. So, in other words, the framework, which is that of Brown motion of independent Gaussian increments, which is taught in every business school, and people who don't get good grades don't get the degree, that thing is sheer idiocy, because it does not represent anything of interest whatsoever. It says everything of interest is beyond that. You need another model for the big changes, which are special. Now, the approach, the fractal approach, actually does not have to go through this emergency. And in fractal approach, everything, the long-tailedness and the long-term dependence and everything are covered by a single model. It assumes that all these things are a system, and in a way, the problem is not addressed to the portfolio of any of you. And incidentally, please don't ask me about my portfolio, because I don't discuss politics, sex, religion, or portfolio. But on a bigger issue for science, and actually that's the issue which brought me the subject now for, almost 45 years ago. We had this amazing amount of information from prices of a system which has proven its resiliency. It seems to totter disaster and resumes activity. How it works is not a matter, but an engineer or somebody like myself, and I will come back to it in a moment, finds irresistible to try to describe it without first trying to explain it. And so maybe I should come back a little bit in my life. I made a few hints about my very strange and complicated and probable life. At one time, age 20 or so, I became, my ambition was to become, take current terms, to become the Kepler of complexity. To find some simple laws, like the Kepler laws of motion of planets around the sun, which would apply to the more complex phenomena that I wanted to study. So my friends were saying, why be so modest? Why don't you try to aspire to be Newton? Well, I had a very good reason for it. In fact, many reasons. That is, there was quite a large number of people I knew had claimed to be Newtons of different fields. Well, Karl Marx had claimed that, and Freud, and these are best known. All kinds of individuals said, I've explained everything essential, and you guys, your job is to deduce practical consequences of it, which nobody was able to do. So that was not getting anywhere, and their lofty ambitions, to me, were of particularly unimpressive character. They can have high ambitions, but that's not the main thing. What were achievements? They achieved nothing. So I felt if I could only represent those terrible messes by a few invariances, since every properly trained mathematical physicist is trained to worship invariances, I could get very, very far indeed. And so all this consisted in taking an invariance which was based upon folklore of stock market, take it seriously, develop it, expand it, and so on, and use it to represent price variation with increasing precision. And so I would like to show more detail, but before I go on, I would like to comment about this picture at the left. The main argument used in various business school type of discussion on stock market is that it's very important to keep all moments finite, because one wants to apply the central limit theorem or the law of large numbers and such things. The idea being that if you wait long enough, things average out. Now, I've been always very impressed by the fact that if things average out, they take longer than the history of humanity, because what we know, even long periods, has not averaged out. For example, here at the left, what you have is a history. These are histories of say, a few years, 2, 3, and this was 100 years. Well, it's a square. It had been sort of processed in, I think, excessively energetic fashion by the author, but it's the best data I could get. This is the variation of 100 years. That and the square of that hardly differ. So there was no evidence whatsoever that things averaged out over a century. So the idea of looking at processes that would not average out at all, with the fixed points under these averaging procedures, were very, very tempting. So the processes in question are fixed points with respect to that. Well, the basic construction is there. You start with a trend, which is marked as initiator, and it always goes up. No economic journal would allow you to make it down. So, and then you add this generator, you repeat it by affinity, so you squeeze it horizontally and vertically, so it fits, and you get this and so on. You get this thing. Now, next picture does it a little bit better. So here is the middle, the same thing, but I take 3 possibilities: down, up, 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 down. And choose one of the 3 at random. At the end, you get this sequence of increments. It's very, very close to independent Gaussian variables. Please believe me, by design. You add a certain wrinkle, you get big changes. You add this other wrinkle, you get persistence or anti-persistence. So let me point that out. And you see here on the bottom, there are many, say, years on which the thing is positive, sometimes negative, and then many years is negative. Now, this process, I developed it in a little bit later, after this big deviations, to study what I call the Joseph and Noah effect on the River Nile. Now, the Bible, imagine, I had legitimate reason to put the Bible as a reference in a scientific article. Genesis, the 7 fat years, 7 years. The Bible says it was 7 fat years, 7 years, and better records say there were also 17 and 70. As a matter of fact, in the first approximation, the history of pharaonic Egypt is when there was plenty of water. The great pharaohs who built the pyramids and they conquered the world, and there was little water, the pyramids went to pot, and Egypt was conquered by all its neighbors. It's a kind of simplified story. So this is a period of, say, Ramses II. He was in the but you obtain that by just changing the generator a little bit. The one on top is anti-persistent. So as you have gone in one direction, you have very high probability of going back. So here, to understand it, you must look at the increments. because this is sort of boring. Here, this is sort of boring. You must look at the thing itself. It goes up and down because each time it got gone out, it goes up. Well, and then you continue. You change again the generator. And here you start again with something which is essentially Brownian. Here has long periods here. By this very simple process, which has in effect a single a parameter which is made of two reals, namely the position of first break, because it's symmetric generator, you can obtain all these things and all these things, and they correspond to very, very different behaviors. Now, here's an example of something which follows, which is actually extremely important and basic. So one chooses one of these zigzags and 8 different seeds. And so these 8 processes are certifiably the same since we obtained the same process. They're completely different. And by the bad analysis, which is analysis you learn in statistics departments, they would say they're completely different. By the proper multifractal analysis, they are identical. Then here you have a kind of phase diagram in which the point of break is the generator is appears like that. So the first break point is in this quarter, and depending where you are, you get all the various models. So that's a very, very simple collection of cartoons. It does not pretend to be completely realistic. These things, one certainly after looking at them for some time, one finds differences between these very crude ones and the ones that I showed you in the first color picture. But these are the simplest possible multifractals, the equivalent of multinomial multifractals, and the whole category of freer and freer multifractals, which gives you an amazing fit to all that. Well, let me just, this book on the left was my 97, a book which has half of it is reprints of old papers from the 60s, and then the other half has discussions of the concepts I very rapidly touched, the converging phenomena called mild randomness, and the diverging ones, the wild randomness, and multifractals. Then this one has the pictures I showed you. This is something which I mentioned of teaching, very effective. This is a book which I wrote with Richard Hudson. Richard Hudson was, at the time, editor-in-chief of Wall Street Journal Europe, and I met him, and then we had several interactions. On one of the interactions, actually, he had me participate in a symposium on risk for very high-level financial executives and so on. The first speaker was Mr. Palmer, whom you know by name at least. I was the last but one. Then at the end, people were asked to vote. And one of my most surprising claims to distinction is that we shared being first. So he and I we declared interesting, everybody else declared very boring. That meeting. I was telling these things, and these guys first of all said we wouldn't understand anything, but then they said, that's exactly our life. We know that. We know that these small changes don't matter. The big ones are the ones make you, break you. Well, it was a very good story. Now, Richard decided to change his life and no longer do editing, and he offered to write this book with me. But I would like now to go back and summarize, returning this matter of roughness. The techniques of interpolation used here are multifractal interpolation. It flows naturally from fractal interpolation. It requires more parameters. It requires more knowledge. It gives a much greater complication. And why is it that it represents these data, at least qualitatively, in so outstanding fashion, and even quantitatively in such a fashion? And the remark being true for both turbulence of fluids and the stock market, I don't know why it is so. But one thing is clear, is that these were the first techniques which handled the question of roughness. The simplest cases, roughness characterized by a single parameter, which is the Hölder exponent, local version of the Hölder exponent, which happens to be measurable and to be repeatable. In more complicated cases, it requires a whole bunch of parameters that require roughness through a distribution, a spectrum, as some people prefer to say. But one should not be too, delicate in the absence of any competition whatsoever, because there's no systematic description of these things that competes with this one. It's a good idea to first understand this one. Now, many people tell me that I'm being ridiculous, that the full library is full of journals, each of them full of papers. But those papers actually make a point of representing data and then truncating everything so that the central limit theorem applies, that the law of large number applies. In fact, everything ordinary applies in the long run. And somehow it's satisfactory to some minds that the model applies in the long run. But if the model applied in the long run and say that nothing is happening, that model would be a very poor description of reality, since reality is as rough on the long run than on the short run. In addition, as Lord Keynes pointed out repeatedly, in the long run we shall all be dead. But the similarity of approach may only be a matter of lack of alternative. That's unfortunate, but still not a good reason not to study this system first and to find its flaws, of which I found many, so I have successive improved models. The abundance of data has become quite extraordinary, and I went very fast because I didn't want to interrupt. About the test of these ideas, of this invariance, it's very easy to get 5 orders of magnitude, or 6 or 7. 5 is easy. Now, 5 orders of magnitude is plenty in many fields of physics. In fact, people are happy with 3 or 4. So the precision of that model in the best cases is outstanding. Best cases being, like for example, dollar Deutschmark or dollar euro exchange, which data go over a very long period and are known at very small time intervals. One can really know the prices every 2 minutes or something. Well, anyhow, if there are questions, I'll be happy to try to answer, but I would like to thank you again for your attention and to having shown that you are awakened to the end of the talk. Thank you.
Why don't we take a couple of questions, and then Benoit will sign books for people.
In the book, you describe this Gaussian model. You also say that the Black-Scholes option model is dependent upon that curve for that Gaussian model and not dependent on yours.
Well, Black-Scholes depends upon the Gaussian model very strictly. The Gaussian model is slightly off, Black-Scholes does not apply. So you ask me how come it has lived so long? In fact, because nobody applies Black-Scholes. They claim it. So I will give a lecture of this sort to a much smaller group, and the boss of that company told me, but look, I know it applied. I mean, my options were computed according to Black-Scholes. And I said, but which volatility do you put in? Oh, of course, we decide in advance what price to give to it, and then so we put different volatilities until we got the price we hit, and that volatility which we put in was sort of reasonable, and that's what we reported. So in reality, I mean, I used to be more polite on this account, but I think it was not applied because everybody knows perfectly well that it's ridiculous. Because you just do it again, and you get volatility that changes immensely. For example, for cotton. So Hartaker was complaining that he couldn't get the volatility of cotton. And I quoted in this paper, which is reproduced, actually, no, it's not reproduced in the book with Hudson, because he said that we must not have a single formula, and so this was a bit too complicated. It's reproduced in my book. And so you plot the volatility of cotton over this period of a year, I think, 2 years, and varied over 2 orders of magnitude. But if you want to say the volatility of cotton was something, or 10 times more, 10 times less, you could do it by taking a suitable sample. So volatility simply doesn't exist. So it's impossible to apply these models. And before that was Mercury's portfolio analysis based again upon mean and variance. The mean is all right. The variance is very evanescent. Just so it's it is not at all an indictment of people who actually do who are in the market. They are very shrewd and they know perfectly well that this model has its weaknesses. Now people have gone to an interesting fashion to look for other processes for which the argument which leads to Black-Scholes could be repeated. So a generalized Black-Scholes applies to under some models, but those models don't represent reality. Yes?
If we turn that around, there are some of these black box companies around who claim to do it better than the market. Are they using your model?
Well, many claim to do so, but when I speak to them, you don't show much evidence of understanding it. and also the black box companies, I'm trying to. So just take any of the magazines, not towards the journal, just nothing takes these sides, but other of the investor magazines. There are pages and pages of fractional investing, plenty. Some of them are just fly by night, others persist somehow. At one time there was one, I will not name them, they were advertising every second year on the basis of the previous year. So last year we did so terribly well, and then a year later they were not advertising because we didn't do very well. So there are many ways of convincing people more than they do about the market. But I know a number of people who actually are using it and who understand it, but they are not individuals. They are substantial because the risks become colossal. In fact, the fact that much of the stock market interest is in extreme values used to be a wild notion several years ago, but now I know several guys who are perfectly sensible, who are doing very, very well because they just only deal on big price changes. In fact, one of them told me that he had an employee, he hired a very bright young man, who after 6 months of doing nothing became extremely bored, unsettled, and so he had to go because he was not functioning. But that job consists in doing nothing until time to do something and doing very briefly. It's like warfare, boredom most of the time, and terrible fright for a few critical periods.
Why don't we thank them?